morning, everybody. We'll get started. I'm Maravik Mabanag, and I'm the former Chief Executive of the California State Domestic Violence Coalition. Thank you for joining us, and I'm also a co-founder with Connie Valentine of ACES, Advocates for Children's Empowerment and Safety, which is a political action committee. It may be a surprise or a shock to some of you that 58,000 children have been placed in the custody of the wrong parent, of a parent that's either abusive, physically, or sexually. So this has now become what we've discovered first in California in the last 15 years, has become a growing national epidemic. So today's congressional briefing, we're very thankful for all the staffers that are here, and we'd like to meet you right afterwards. We're very grateful that we are actually building a movement to try and deal with this growing national epidemic. This is not only costing physical, emotional, sexual harm to children, but putting more children at risk as we speak. But in addition, it's a huge social and fiscal cost to our states and to the federal government. So today we have experts as well as survivors of the family court system who will be addressing you to help inform, educate, and hopefully move our members of Congress towards some kinds of action, different types of actions that we will be looking to your different bosses for an ask. So for today, though, I'd like to introduce our speakers. The first one is Connie Valentine, the founder of the California Protective Parents Association, Dr. Leora Rosen, who will be making a presentation. Some of you will be getting copies of her PowerPoint presentation because we have a little technical glitch. And Dr. Rosen was the former National Institute of Justice Senior Social Science Analyst who has managed research programs related to violence against women and family violence. She's also the author of Beyond the Hostage Child and towards empowering protective parents. So she will describe what these human rights abuses are and violations that are happening and federal policies that have unintended consequences and what can we do as solutions. And we will also hear from Brian and one of the mothers who survived and still going through the custody battle. Around you today, you are flanked by mothers of lost children. So we hope that you each will figure out who those mothers are that are members or constituents of your district, because that will be your responsibility to be in touch, and we will also inform you in your states, because we are now a national network of really looking at this problem and this epidemic. So we hope that you will take a little bit of time. I know everyone here is always on a time crunch, and so we are too, because for us this problem is so serious and needs immediate solutions. So without much further ado, I'm going to let Connie Valentine take over.
Thank you. I would just like to go over a little bit of the research that shows that there is a problem, a pattern, and a practice of taking children from safe parents and giving them to violent, incestuous parents once they report abuse. The first question is, are children being placed at risk? That's a valid question. It sounds so counterintuitive. But Dr. Geraldine Staley studied 399 cases from 39 states of children who were placed at risk, despite a safe parent ready and willing and able to care for them. Her study confirmed other research showing that 60 to 75% of children of divorce who report abuse are given into the partial or full custody of their identified abusers. The problem is far worse in California, where 85% of the children were placed at risk. The Center for Judicial Excellence has studied 566 child deaths in under a decade that resulted from dangerous custody decisions. The next question is this a gender issue? We thought not when we began California Protective Parents Association. We thought it would be 50-50, more or less, of men and women. But in over a decade and a half, our organization has received over 5,000 contacts from people all over the country. 4,990 of them were from women, 10 were from men. So it does seem to be a gender issue. Is this a domestic violence issue? Dr. Staley found that 90% of the surveyed mothers reported being battered, along with 70% of their children. are children placed with sexual abusers? That's a big question because everyone says sexual abuse is an epidemic in family court. That's not true. A study of 9,000 consecutive cases of just general divorce custody cases showed that there was less than 2% of cases that were child sex abuse. So it's very rare in family court. However, in these cases that were studied, 64%, a whopping 64% of the children had reported sex abuse when they were changed to their abusers. Research shows that only 2 to 6% of children fabricate child sex abuse, but 90% of the children who reported it were left unprotected and in fact shoved into the arms of their abusers. The problem is so egregious and pervasive that advocates call it child trafficking, judicial trafficking. It fits the definition, the United Nations definition of trafficking exactly. The sad part is that 2/3 of the children, or the brave part, 2/3 of the children continue to report abuse even after being placed with their abusers. And the last question Maribek has already answered, is this a large issue? Yes. There are no government statistics kept on this, even though in California they're supposed to keep statistics on custody outcomes. But there aren't. They're not doing it. So we estimate that in the last 20 years that we've been working on this situation, over 1 million children have been placed at risk. Our experts will tell you how this came to pass, but I just want to guarantee you that it does exist. And I also wanted to give a big shout out to Judith Reisman. Dr. Reisman did the original research on Alfred Kinsey showing that pedophilia was rampant, and it was the fake science that was driving it. She is our scientific advisor. So as you listen, not only to the expert, but especially to the witnesses, there'll be 4, just imagine what you would do if you were ordered to take the person you most loved to be beaten and raped. It was your job to take them in your car and deliver them to be beaten and raped, knowing that state and international law prohibits this crime. War correspondent Keith Harmon Snow said in his book, The Worst Interests of the Child, this is not like organized crime. This is not similar to organized crime. This is organized crime. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Rosen.
Thank you, Connie. I hope that most people here have copies of my slides. I do apologize about the audio-visual deficits. We did try to get things organized, but it just didn't work out. So all I have here is my laptop computer and my printed slides. So I'm just going to try to do the best I can to, convey this information. So I've called this briefing Court-Ordered Child Endangerment, History of the Problem and Proposed Federal Solutions. And it's similar to a presentation I gave a couple of days ago at the Battered Women's Custody Conference, but I have modified it a bit. For those who were there, I apologize if there's a lot of repetition, but I'll try to make it interesting nevertheless. So I begin now with how I began before, which was asking frequently asked questions. If it's true that children are being taken away from their safe parents and placed in the unsupervised control of named abusers, why would anyone do that? Where's the domestic violence community? Where are the child protective services? And don't mothers always get custody? One of the major points that I made in my previous presentation, I'm going to go over it again today, but more briefly. The story begins in the mid-19th century. Most people don't know this. It was in Britain in 1839 when the British Parliament passed what was known as the Infant Custody Act, which gave innocent married mothers the right to petition the court for access to their children upon marital separation, bearing in mind that divorce was virtually impossible in those days and required an act of Parliament, but separation was not that uncommon. Typically, the husband would leave the wife, take up with a mistress, and it turned out that the father had the sole right to allow or disallow access to the child, no matter how innocent the mom, no matter how much of a philanderer or adulterer or a wife-beater he was. So the law that passed in 1839 came to be known as the Tender Years Doctrine, or it became the basis for the Tender Years Doctrine that was influential in custody determinations both in the UK and in the United States. And this influence lasted for well over 100 years. Now, what people don't know is that the rationale for the original legislation was that fathers who exercised the right to deny access were recognized as being abusers. And the member of parliament who got this legislation passed presented 5 cases to the British Parliament involving innocent mothers who had lost access to their children as a result of the actions of abusers. One of them is a very famous case, Lady Caroline Norton. She petitioned very hard for this legislation, writing under the name, under an assumed male name, of course, because, you know, those were times when women didn't do these kinds of things. But I should point out that this legislation passed in Great Britain 79 years before women got the vote, 43 years before women were allowed to own property, 43 years before there was such a thing as civil divorce, and something like 20 years before married women were allowed to own property in their own right. And this was considered to be more fundamental to women's needs than those other rights that they later got. And this was legislation that was passed by a patriarchal, all-male British Parliament. And it's important to recognize that they understood that this was behavior of abusers, not all men. If they had thought for 1 minute that this was something that was going to affect all men, I can assure you it would have never passed. But they recognized it and they did something about it. So here we are, and now we're back to where we started. Abusers have regained the sole right to determine a mother's access to her children. How did this happen? So I'm going to roughly go over 4 major factors that I believe contributed to this. I apologize if this is going to sound a little boring going back over history, but I think it's important. If we want to reverse what has happened, we've got to understand how it came about. So the 4 factors that I've identified was, number 1, the feminist movement spurred changes in gender roles, which encouraged fathers to be more involved in childcare, and this was seen as a positive thing. Then divorce reform in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, eliminated the requirement of fault for ending marriages. And then we had the victim advocacy movements of the 70s and 80s, which exposed abuse that was previously hidden from public view and promoted safety and justice for victims. And finally, we had improvements in child support enforcement, and part of that was the development of fatherhood programs. So I'm going to go over each of these individually. So, number 1, the feminist movement, what I regard as misguided feminism. So in 1973, a woman judge by the name of Sybil Hart Cooper, who was regarded as a champion of women's rights, a trailblazer, the first female admitted to the Metropolitan Trial Lawyers Association of New York, and appointed to the family bench in 1973, reversed the Tender Years Doctrine in a famous case called Watts versus Watts. And in that case, she ruled that mothering is a gender-neutral function, and she ruled that any presumptive preference for maternal custody violates the father's right to equal protection under the 14th Amendment. Now, this was obviously a state court decision. It doesn't have any implications, for the nation as a whole, in terms of legal precedent, but it was influential. Just as the Tender Years Doctrine, which influenced the United States, even though it was enacted in Britain, this court ruling was influential across the nation in a similar kind of way, even though it wasn't legal precedent for every state. Then divorce reform. So prior to the 1970s, in most jurisdictions, divorce required a showing of fault. And typically it was the woman who filed for divorce and the man who was filed against on the basis of such grounds as adultery, desertion, or cruelty. With fault divorce, custody went to the innocent party. That's how it worked. Now, fault divorce had a lot of faults, one of which was a major one, that when people just wanted to get divorced, somebody had to agree to be at fault, and you'd have these kind of trumped-up scenarios where the man would agree to be caught in a motel room with a woman, not his wife. The maid would walk in, see them, testify in court, you got your divorce. It was widely understood that many, many, many of these divorces were based on false testimony. And it was considered to be unseemly, and judges hated it, and so they welcomed no-fault divorce. But no-fault divorce meant no one is ever at fault, and this also left a vacuum in terms of, so how are we going to decide custody, how are we going to decide child support, alimony, etc. And this vacuum came to be filled by what we now call the divorce industry. And then third, victim advocacy movements. So while all of these other things are going on, you have the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 1974. Children are being educated to report abuse, sexual abuse or physical abuse. 20 years later, we have VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act. Women are now being encouraged to leave their abusers, to seek protective orders, and to go to shelters and receive services. So all of these victims are now coming out into the community, reporting abuse, and wanting to leave their abusers. And a part of that was also the incest survivor movement. Even though it wasn't politicized in the same way, it also raised consciousness about victimization and thus fed into this whole new notion of increased reporting. And then finally, number 4, child support enforcement. So with the skyrocketing divorce related to you didn't have to prove fault anymore, there was a problem with enforcing child support. Who was going to support all of these children who were now of divorced families? So in 1974, Congress enacted Title 4D of the amendment to the Social Security Act, establishing the Office of Child Support Enforcement. And this was primarily directed to families receiving welfare. But one of the components of the legislation was establishing a system for ensuring child support payments from federal employees and members of the armed services through involuntary wage garnishing. So these were middle-class men. Suddenly, they didn't have control over paying child support. It was just taken out of their paychecks. And this is what spurred the development of the fathers' rights movement. And associated with child support enforcement were fatherhood programs. These programs were created as part of the child support enforcement legislation. And they were created in the 1990s by fathers' rights activists, in which they directed federal and state and private funds to programs to promote father involvement with their children and child support compliance. And this is important because even though it's a small aspect of the bigger problem, it's one in which the federal government has some say, has a lot of say, in fact. And so I have a graphic. I don't know if you can see this, but I'll show it to you how it all came together. It just sort of illustrates the interrelationship between these different components. Fault-free divorce, vacuum filled by divorce industry, more divorces, need for child support enforcement, fatherhood programs, more fathers seeking custody, and then victim advocacy, bringing victims out, seeking justice and to be separated from their abusers. And then you have the backlash from alleged abusers saying that they were falsely accused. And the overarching sort of cultural value that kind of let all this happen was what I regard as misguided feminism that denigrated motherhood and promoted father custody. Here again is a little graphic that I did. You'll find it in your packets. I call this the father supremacy triumvirate, showing that there's a relationship, as kind of a circular relationship between the father's rights movement, fatherhood programs, and the divorce industry, which I'll illustrate with more information. So what is the father's rights movement, and what is it they want, and what do they do? So when I was a social science analyst at the National Institute of Justice, we did an intramural study, research study, in which we content analyzed 285 fathers' rights websites that were active between September 2003 and March 2005. And we looked at the kinds of themes that were discussed on the website, and then we did some analyses. So just to give you a brief overview, 81% discussed child support, 67% promoted joint custody, 32% claimed that moms make false allegations of child abuse, 30% said that men are the primary victims of domestic violence, 24% claimed that wives make false allegations of domestic violence, 23% discussed parental alienation syndrome, and 22% discussed paternity. When we conducted state-level analyses, we found that the number of fathers' rights themes correlated with overall higher income in that state, higher median income. But the number of fathers' rights websites in proportion to the state population correlated with gender disparity in income. In other words, it correlated with men having much higher income than women. And this kind of ties in with what Professor Carol Brooke of UC Davis School of Law has pointed out in a recent paper that Connie sent me. Basically, wealthy divorcing fathers created a market for the divorce industry. And how this came about was, they came to fill this vacuum filled by no-fault divorce, these professionals felt that they had to give their clients something. Clients with the deepest pockets were men, and so interventions were tailored for their needs. And these needs included minimizing child support and defenses against abuse allegations. So now there are many components of the divorce industry. We have lawyers, we have custody evaluators, judges, and so on. But I'm going to focus on custody evaluators who have a lot of influence here. So they tend to treat abuse as driven by conflict between parties to be resolved through mediation or other dispute resolution techniques. And in a study that was funded by the National Institute of Justice, the study found that only 23% of custody evaluators were able to recognize coercive controlling aspects of abuse in a vignette that they were asked to evaluate. The study also found that the most likely recommendations were joint custody and unsupervised visitation, and this was all for a domestic violence case. And other studies have shown that while custody evaluators claim that they recognize domestic violence as a factor to consider in custody recommendations, studies of actual custody recommendations show that domestic violence is not a factor in their decisions. So what they say and what they do are very different. The other thing about custody evaluators and the divorce industry in general, they are purveyors of what I call alternative facts. I think the concept of alternative facts actually originated with the divorce industry, and especially in the creation of parental alienation syndrome as an explanation for allegations of child abuse. Now, there are two kinds of parental alienation syndrome, or parental alienation theory, if you will. The original one, which I call the first generation, was that mothers were coaching or brainwashing their children to lie about abuse in order to get back at a hated ex-spouse. But this theory somewhat fell into disrepute because its originator, Dr. Richard Gardner, had expressed tasteful pro-pedophilic opinions. So a second generation emerged led by respected divorce professionals Joan Kelly and Janet Johnston, who came up with a better theory, that parental alienation and abuse can coexist. What they say is, yes, a father can abuse a child, and the child can be traumatized, but if after treatment for the trauma of the abuse, the child still doesn't want a relationship with the abuser, this could still be parental alienation on the part of the protective parent. They say, furthermore, it is not normal for a mom to not want her child to have a relationship with the dad, no matter what he may have done. Now just think about that for a minute. And finally, they say that alienating behavior may be unconscious. For example, warm and loving, supportive parenting on the part of the mom could cause the children to gravitate towards her and become alienated from the dad. And that is a terrible thing and requires, serious intervention. Okay? Why would people come up with such garbage, you wonder? Well, the divorce industry is very profitable. Estimates place its value at $50 billion a year. And we see that divorce industry professionals have developed their own system for marketing, evaluating these alternative facts. The point is that as long as judges are willing to accept these alternative facts, dissent and criticism from professionals outside the family court system is irrelevant. And among the worst cases that you are likely to see in which judges have been convinced to send children away to psychological torture camps to cure parental alienation, costing thousands of dollars, threatening to jail the protective mom if the child resists, and sometimes forcing the mom to share the costs. So we're now coming to the third component of this father's supremacy triumvirate, which is fatherhood programs, and this is where the federal government comes in. So the fatherhood programs were spearheaded in the 1990s by fathers' rights advocates, riding the wave of congressional enthusiasm for welfare reform, which included promoting the formation of two-parent families, preventing unwed pregnancies, and getting divorced or single fathers to pay child support. The enabling legislation was actually written by a staunch fathers' rights advocate, Ron Haskins, who at that time was staff director of the Human Resources Subcommittee of the House Ways and Means Committee, and is now on an advisory committee of a fathers' rights organization. By and large, the standards for these fatherhood programs are determined at the state level by divorce industry professionals, some of whom benefit financially from grants and contracts. So when these programs were created, fathers' rights principles were embedded in them. They were kind of written into the legislation. For example, programs were justified on the basis of sweeping, uncritical, and exaggerated propaganda about fatherhood. Past program managers in the Department of Health and Human Services had fathers' rights affiliations or endorsed fathers' rights principles. For example, parental alienation has shown up in the language of some federal contracts. Abuse was ignored. In one memo circulated for about 2 years in the Department of Health and Human Services, grantees were instructed to focus only on promoting fathers' access to children and to ignore domestic violence or child sexual abuse if it came up. So there are basically three groups of fathers' rights programs, and I would like to put it up on a screen to show you, but you have it in your packet, so I'll just mention them briefly here. There's the Access and Visitation Program, which is a formula grant program awarding $10 million annually. There is no requirement in that program to address domestic violence. It's recommended, but no requirement. Then you have the Responsible Fatherhood and Healthy Marriage grants, and I have a typo, you'll notice. It says $150 a year, it's actually $150 million. Those have, in those programs, federal grant managers have more control, and they can require involvement of the domestic violence community, but the problem with those grants is that even where they have a requirement to partner with the domestic violence community, there's no money in the grant to pay for that. So you're asking DV professionals to volunteer their time, and you get what you pay for. And then there's TANF, and that's a very complicated piece of the puzzle, because states are allowed to use some TANF money for programs other than helping needy families, and many of them have used TANF funds for fatherhood programs. We don't know exactly how much money, but they do. And as regards those programs, we don't know much at all about how the money is spent. But I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to give you just 2 final slides in this segment. Sorry to have gone on for so long, but this is important. So there have been some evaluations of these fatherhood programs. Some of them are federally funded, some of them not, but it kind of gives you a sense of what they're actually doing, what they're about. So one program that was evaluated by the Mathematica Policy Research, who put out a report in 2015 on the qualitative component of a randomized controlled trial of 4 fatherhood programs. So this tells you where their thinking is. They said 95% of the fathers in that program had some contact with the criminal justice system, and many had substance abuse problems. Their focus, however, was on what they call maternal gatekeeping, which is mothers restricting fathers' access to the children, noting that the fathers complained a great deal about having contentious relationships with the children's mothers. Now, the authors acknowledge there could be a good reason for gatekeeping, such as domestic violence or child maltreatment, but they never even asked about the reasons. They never even addressed domestic violence or child maltreatment. And in the end, their recommendation was that responsible fatherhood programs should provide more referrals to legal services for non-custodial fathers to establish parenting time. No mention of the safety of mothers and children. So that was one evaluation. Another evaluation. This was a program that combined federal, state, and private funds. It was reported on by the National Responsible Fatherhood Clearinghouse, published in 2009. And the evaluation was of the John S. Martinez Fatherhood Initiative in Connecticut. This is a program that includes job assistance and legal assistance with custody for non-custodial fathers. Okay, the evaluation, this was a descriptive evaluation, not a randomized controlled trial. However, it's very telling. 35% of the fathers in the program who received legal assistance with custody had a history of arrests for DV, and 17% had protective orders against them. The program, however, did not address DV or safety of moms and kids at all. And in the end, what the study found was that there were modest improvements in employment and in child support payment. However, 65% of the dads either had no income or income below $15,000 a year. The reports of strained relationships with the moms had increased. But the one positive outcome, yay, one positive outcome, was increase in father custody from 5% to 20%, a 400% improvement. Wow. Criminal background, unemployed, custody. Okay, so that ends my first part of the briefing, and I'll talk later about federal solutions.
Now we're going to hear from a mother who has gone through the family court crisis nightmare. Vicky?
Thank you to everybody, all the staffers. We really do appreciate your time and interest in this issue. As you've heard from Leora, this is quite a serious issue that's been long-term, and there's a lot of bodies laying in the wake of this. Most of them are our children's bodies. There are some things in life that are indescribable nightmares. And one is when a parent discovers that their child may have been sexually abused. What adds a horrible layer to that is when that may be the other parent. Now, we think we're going to get help because we've been taught that. We think that there's sources, there's resources. And if you just tell what happened, you're going to get help, your child will be protected. But then you go down the rabbit hole. There's no lifeline, and all the entities that are supposed to help you, that you think will help you, you're reaching up and asking, what can I do? How do we deal with this? No one's there to answer. They don't know. They don't have an answer. Or what even adds insult to injury is the fact that you start discovering that people start looking at you as if you're making it up and your child's a liar. So essentially what we have now is a system where there's criminal activity taking place. You come into contact with a lot of so-called professionals who are not qualified in assessing this situation, and you find a conduit that instead of going into the criminal venue, the perpetrator is allowed to find safe haven and sanctuary in the setting of a family court, whereby you are now divested of everything that means anything to you. The most important being your child. You are called a liar. Your child is vilified. You're criminalized. You have these people that you're sent to go have meetings with, not court reporters, but social workers or so-called forensic experts, none of whom have any expertise in this area anyway. They're not qualified in domestic violence, sexual trauma, childhood abuse, none of this. And the things that are said to you in this process, not only in this setting of a so-called psychologist or social worker, but also in the courtroom, is absolutely insulting. And every mother that's here, and every mother that's gone through the process, if you heard what is being said, you'd be appalled. The psychologist in my case referred to me, as a feminist, but you're not one of those bad feminists, that wants to destroy men. There was medical evidence in the case, in my daughter's case, and at 6 years of age, she had no hymen. It was clear that something happened to her. And what happens is when you try to get help for your child, Child Protective Services told me I needed to take my child for an examination. That was my responsibility, or I would be charged with neglect. When I did that, and I took her to the emergency room, where she had a full examination, physical and sexual, and they discovered abuse. Later on in the court, I was punished for that because there was something wrong, because I kept imagining that there was sexual abuse, even though we had medical evidence. On the day that the head of the pediatric emergency department came in to testify in court, which is really rare, but I have to mention, because children are young and their bodies heal, oftentimes the evidence isn't readily viewable. You have to have other expertise. In my daughter's case, it was evident. And this doctor came in to testify. And after some very horrendous testimony, as you're sitting there as a mother to hear what actually happened to your child, the judge actually sent my daughter home with the accused perpetrator. I was put on supervised visitations. I had people watching me, including my former sister-in-law, who was protecting the perpetrator. And on a Thanksgiving when she couldn't make it, I was forced to let the perpetrator in my home to supervise me and the child. I refer to the information that I got from my daughter as ungodly conversations. No one should ever have those with their children. To know your daughter's going through a nightmare, or your child's going through a nightmare situation, is afraid to talk about it, and is thwarted from talking about it. We were going through court. I was put on trial. Near the end of the proceedings, my daughter actually named the perpetrator, because up to this point I had no idea. I was just trying to find out who hurt my daughter. So the accusation that I was targeting my ex-husband was baseless. When it came time to, when she shared something with me, she finally got to a point where she actually named the perpetrator. And I was trying to figure out what happened, how it happened, and she goes, "Mom, it's okay, Mommy, you can touch me. My daddy does it anyway." My daughter wrote a note to school officials and slipped it under the social worker's door. "My name is so-and-so. I'm in this classroom. My daddy touches me where he's not supposed to. He comes into my room at night and touches me where he's not supposed to. Please don't tell the principal. Please don't tell him." And one of the other horrible aspects about this is no one helps you. School officials, in my case, former colleagues, block me from seeing my daughter. If I try to get a note to my daughter, stick it in her locker. That was reported in court. I was accused of my daughter being my love interest or my love object. She's my daughter. I'm supposed to love her. There was a social worker who did a filming, spent 50 minutes on me, I think 17 minutes on my daughter, and 5 minutes on the accused perpetrator. And again, everyone along the line all took the same stance, that nothing happened, you keep imagining this, and you're a good mom, but ultimately psychologists recommended full legal custody, physical and legal, to the named perpetrator. What happens is, along with supervised visitation and increasingly limited time, and the extraction of all your funds, by the way, they do access your funds, and if you have any retirement programs, they will access them as a way to thwart you from going to a higher level. If you try to get that outside of in another venue, they will find ways to thwart it. There was an attorney on the other side. She and the accused perpetrator both claimed they never received notification from the court. It was an outside court. So there's little things they do. Friday night ex parte hearings or notifications. So you're always at a disadvantage legally. And all of us have gone through everything we've had, trying to fight for our children. But the ultimate goal is the same. They will separate you from your child after they've extracted every last dime from you. Your child will be harmed physically, emotionally. The person that loves them and protects them will be taken from them. All of their contacts, their communities that you've built, they will be pulled out of. And we're asking for help. We're trying to shed some light on this situation because it's racketeering, it's trafficking, because the only people benefiting from this are the people making all the money. Mm-hmm. So our children are going into a venue that is supposed to be safe, and the rule of law is supposed to prevail, and evidence is supposed to be heard. And the children need to come first. And it's been a really nasty secret in this country, and if we're going to hold ourselves to be a beacon of light to other nations in this world, we need to start by protecting our children.
Okay, thank you, Vicki. Now we're going to hear from a child who is actually aged out of the family court system, our friend Brian. And we have two more mothers, and then we will go towards some of the federal solutions. So I'd like to ask everybody to kind of make their comments brief, because in the interest of time of the staffers, it would be really important for them to hear what we are really interested in the kind of work we want them to help pursue with their members of Congress.
My name's Brian. I didn't experience any of the sexual abuse or anything of that. Mine was more of a mental ramifications of the system overall after a divorce that started in 1996 and lasted last contact with my mother was about 2001. Now we live in a society where it's supposed to be, the punishment should fit the crime. And for myself, it almost felt like I was being charged with the crime. And my crime was basically being born to a mother who's strong-willed and loved me, and a father who was strong-willed and would destroy anybody who stood against him. I could go on and on about what happened in the years between their initial divorce and the final verdict of my case, if you will. But basically, the guardian ad litems, what are they called? The people who were supposed to be watching out for me and displaying what I or relaying what I wanted to court, to the parents I wanted to see. None of it mattered. Yeah, my pleas fell on deaf ears. I had to go to numerous psychiatrists, and they were supposed to be my voice towards the court system. It never made it. Finally, in 2002, my sentencing came down, if you will, and my punishment was basically the entire ceasing to see my mother and that entire side of the family. 2002, I saw her 3 visits, all supervised, and that culminated in me kind of being moved away and kidnapped by my father to Maryland here, so outside of the Florida court systems. Other than that, there's some phone calls, always supervised. I was at a psychiatrist's office, and you had to go through my psychiatrist to her psychiatrist. It was all video recorded or audio recorded, and it was like I was a prisoner, like at a prison, like, you know, when you're sitting there and you see them through the pane glass, but I didn't even get to see her because I wasn't even allowed that luxury. In that time frame, my life was stolen, or half of my life was stolen. Basically, my great-grandfather died. I was never even notified that he'd passed. I never got to go to the funeral. You know, my sister got married. I was never notified of anything because anytime my mother would try to contact me, it just would not come through. Basically, what had happened is all contact ceased sometime around the middle of high school because my mother had been sentenced. And that was it. I kind of, at that point, I was about 16, I just assumed that I would never see my mother again, and that entire side of my family was dead. To me, at least. You know, I kind of went on for a few years that was what it was. I never had a mother. It just didn't happen. It never existed until I finally, you know, met a friend who I told my story to, and he pushed me to contact my mother again. And it was one of the best things in my life, reconnecting with my mother. Actually getting a whole side of family back. But in that time, while it was great to come back, it was very sad because what I'd seen happen is that everyone who I'd known and loved was basically a decade older at that point. Because my mother was the only person I'd seen in 2002. Other than that, no other family member was allowed. Because like I said, my father, if you went against my father, that was it. You were his enemies from then until kingdom come. So when I came back, I realized how much I'd missed out on in life. I mean, I had half a family, the dysfunctional half of my father's side, but the other half, you know, I feel like an outsider sometimes because my sister got married. She has 2 nephews now, or I have 2 nephews now. But I would never really click entirely with her husband and my, you know, his brothers because I was never there. I never got to experience that. And now my grandparents are old. I don't know how much longer they'll be around with me, but I missed 10 years of being with them and of being with my aunts and uncles, and they're all far older than I remember. And being robbed of that for petty vengeance from one parent and money by the court system is not an appropriate response, I would say. And
Thank you, Brian.
yeah.
We have a documentary as well. A Center for Judicial Excellence, our Courageous Kids Network. So we invite you to go to that website. It is in one of our resources. Now I'd like to turn it over to Lori to share a story.
Is there anybody from Maine? Okay. So, thank you very much. My name is Lori Anderhan. I've put out the flyers out the front. This is my daughter. She was confirmed for rape by her father at the age of 2 by the sexual assault medical forensic examiners. Beyond a shadow of a doubt. There's medical evidence. She also gave an interview, and I've put these here because I think the documents speak louder than words. Also, in my case, Dr. Larry Ritchie and his co-director of the Medical Examiner Center, it's called Spurwing, testified for 6 hours about how it was the worst case of 2-year-old child rape that they had seen confirmed. And the judge, Judge Moskowitz, turned over a protection order that had been put in place by another judge. It's just the beginning. She also had a near-fatal dose of methamphetamine after a weekend with her father and the attorney, 56 nanograms, which is 10 times the legal limit. That was confirmed by the head of the pediatric toxicology unit at Yale New Haven Hospital. Blunt force trauma to the head by her father by hitting her with a pan, lots of other physical abuse. Judge Moskowitz in Maine, and I talked to the other Maine mothers who couldn't be here, and I said that I would hand these out. There's been a huge outcry against him. I was his second case. Gail Fitzpatrick was his first case. This is an article about what he did to her, dissolving protection orders that have been put in place by other judges. It's basically a system of racketeering, what's happening in the state of Maine. If you're with another judge that's protecting the mother and the children, it'll get case ready to Judge Moskowitz. Now, Governor Baldacci, Democratic governor, put Moskowitz in. We're all appointed in Maine at the 11th hour just before he left office. Jeff Moskowitz's claim to fame before he was any judge was that two Nigerian immigrants gang raped a mentally retarded girl in the Maine Mall, put out cigarette butts all over her body and sperm, and refused to prosecute the Nigerians because they would be deported to Nigeria if they had committed a criminal offense on a green card. This was when he was assistant district attorney, and for that he was made judge. So, I'm also, one more point, it takes a long time to tell the story, we don't have a lot of time. Trump's new executive order on immigration, although we may share different political beliefs in this room, people may say it's controversial, under that new order, my daughter's father is now deportable on several more offenses. He's deportable on 16 offenses. He's a criminal alien from the former Yugoslavia. He was on a temporary green card, which he got by marrying me. I left him before the 2-year limitation, had a protection order in place. He went for his interview for his permanent green card while he was under a protection order for domestic violence against me and my daughter. He had pled guilty to domestic violence against me when my daughter was 3 months old. So he shouldn't have got a green card. He then mail-ordered a bride after I left him. He got citizenship illegally. And she was pregnant also almost immediately upon meeting him. She only stayed a year and a half. He committed domestic violence against her. He got custody of the 2 kids. So you have 2 U.S. citizens. Okay, I ran for Congress in Maine. I have a PhD from the London School of Economics. I was a professor for a long time at American University. I've worked for the UN on and off for 20 years. And I have a parking ticket to my name. And you got a daughter, this little innocent girl who's confirmed for rape at 2 years old. And you got a criminal alien from the former Yugoslavia. And here's his record of crimes that he's deportable for. So what I'm hoping is that some Hill staffer will say this is the poster child for Donald Trump's new executive order. This is the kind of guy that we should be deporting. So far he's being completely protected, and what I wanted to add was his attorney is worth $300 million. His name is Michael Waxman. He's part of the largest corporate real estate family in all of New England. They own the Hyatts, the Marriotts, the law firms. My daughter has been spending weekends with Michael Waxman, the attorney who loves her and has been nurturing a healthy bond with her. And I had a protection order in place from one judge, so my daughter, 2-year-old daughter, couldn't spend weekends with the attorney who loves her. That was again dissolved, sent back to the Portland courts, and I represented myself against Michael Waxman in a 2-day trial where he said under the stand, under oath on the stand, that he would take my daughter from me because he loved her in a way that I couldn't love her and that she deserved his love. Now, if you know anything about pedophiles, right. So I wanted to follow up on your talk. I have very blessed to have a contract for a book, which will be out by the end of the summer. It's called The Epidemic, America's Trade in Child Rape. And what has happened to the family courts is that they have turned into secure supply lines for pedophiles. Yes. America has been producing, for the last 10 years, over half the world's child pornography. Until this year, half of the servers distributing child pornography were based here in America. That means American children. Half of the world's child pornography is an enormous amount. Almost every single arrest is 10, 20, 30,000 videos and images. These are huge things. As of this year, the Internet Watch Foundation has determined that Holland is now distributing most of the child pornography. It's now 60% Europe instead of America. We know where those servers are. We've refused to shut them down. Our governments refused to shut them down. So the Canadian press has also been reporting this in much greater detail than the American press. The Canadian press has come out with 2 recent articles this January and February, one documenting that it is now established among criminal investigators who investigate child pornography that fathers have organized pedophile rings in large numbers. Okay? I've read over 1,000 criminal complaints for my book, and I can tell you, when they put into the criminal complaint the chat history of the pedophiles on these chat networks, they say, I've got custody of my 6-year-old son, I'm sharing him. I have custody of my 2-year-old daughter, I'm sharing him. The way that the cops are getting these guys is that the criminal complaints will detail a Washington, D.C. police officer is in a pedophile chat network, and the Washington, D.C. police officer is saying, I have custody of my 8-year-old son, I'm sharing my son, because the cops know that's what's happening. None of that has been linked back to family court. Why do you think I lost custody of my 2-year-old daughter after she'd been confirmed for rape? She hasn't seen her mother since she was 4, she's 10. She has no idea where I am. No contact. Right. Her father was also discovered in a child porn trading site, and we had a screenshot of his computer by the investigator, which the police refused to investigate. So,
Can we
that's
pause?
a small update on my case.
Sure, you probably feel like you want to throw up because I've done that before listening to these stories. My story is here in the packet you received. I'm from California. I'm the daughter of a former Air Force lieutenant colonel who I was raised in a Christian home where I was taught that a woman's role is to submit, and that if there's abuse, you need to just be a better woman. This is an important detail because I married a man just like my father, he was a Middle Eastern man. He was Palestinian. He was still currently in the Army, and had gone to Harvard. My ex-husband was arrested for domestic violence in 2009, only because someone else called. I never called the police when he could have been arrested. I asked for the charges to be dismissed. Of course, there were 10 police reports. There were multiple witnesses. There were multiple therapists who said this man is a violent abuser. We had 2 children together, Kurt and Kennedy, and he decided that he wanted to join the Foreign Service. He wanted me to sell my home and move out of state back in 2013. And he said he was punishing me by abandoning me with 2 babies because I didn't kiss his ass enough. So he signed over sole physical custody of both children to me, told me to sell our house. Everything was mine legally, but I gave it all to him and left with what I had in my SUV. We relocated to Ohio, where he said, you're doing a great job with your children. You're a fantastic mother, Jacqueline. Thank you so much, for bearing my children, and I hope you continue to do a great job with them. Then after 2 years, he said I would fall apart without him, and when I didn't, and I was successfully doing an international relations program to help women in the Middle East, he said, come back to me, let me pay for you to go to Harvard, move to France with me, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Either way, I'm more than happy to oblige. I was struggling, financially. I was just me with the 2 children. He knew that I was in a very weak economic position at the time. So back in California, he hired a very unethical attorney, and they claimed something that I had never heard before, parental alienation syndrome. Now, I had plenty of evidence of abuse. I had 9 pages of confession letters from my ex-husband where he documented how he put me in headlocks and did these things to the children. They asked for a custody evaluation. Who knew what that was at the time? And the judge demanded that I participate in a custody evaluation. I was told that if I didn't, that I would be arrested and my children would be taken from me. So he hired a very notorious custody evaluator in California named Janelle Burrell O'Donnell, who had been previously charged by now Senator Kamala Harris for gross misconduct and unethical behavior. She wrote a book on parental alienation syndrome in child custody cases, and had children handcuffed and drugged and placed back with their abusers when they said, "Please keep me away from my daddy, I want to stay with my mommy." The problem with the parental alienation syndrome, none of us hate men. You know, this can be, fathers are important. Children should be protected from abusive fathers. And I know from my children, they begged, "Please keep me away from him." So that was, my ex-husband paid Janelle $34,000 to write a custody evaluation for him. Her report came out on September 8th of 2015. Little to my knowledge, they filed an emergency request for an order on September 9th, and told the judge that they thought I might be mentally ill because of parental alienation syndrome, that my little girl said she was terrified of her father. So the judge signed the order, citing a concern of mental illness, and my ex-husband said I fled the state saying I was leaving for 2 weeks to go to Florida. My children, I'm only going to play this for just a moment, because my children were ripped from their beds. On September 10th of 2015, and that's the last time I've had my children. It turned out the custody evaluator sent me a threat letter about what would happen to me if I exposed her, and told me her husband was a federal judge. This turned out to be a lie, but no attorney would take my case because they said it was like the O.J. Simpson trial. I would need a team of attorneys to represent me. So I had to represent myself in a 6-day custody trial where they admitted that it was a lie, that they said I fled the state. And every mental health professional said that I was perfectly stable and that I was one of the best mothers they had ever met. The only problem was that my children wanted to be with me, and that must be my fault. So I was accused of parental alienation syndrome, and I still am not allowed to see my children. I was able to have them every other weekend for 6 months, but because of that, they took me to court again and had a psychologist write a letter saying, "My daughter Kennedy, at 6 years old, is not doing well in her new custody arrangement with her father. All she talks about is being back with her mother and how much she loved her." And her recommendation was that hopefully Kennedy's mother can understand the importance of daily focus instead of being focused on being with her mom. So they put me on supervised visitation again at the cost of $800 a month for me. I get to see my children for 4 hours a week. I don't get to see them on their birthdays or holidays. I don't get to know anything about their schooling, any of their medical care. They're not allowed to call me. All because of this horrific syndrome. My daughter's Mother's Day card to me at the supervised visitation facility said, "I love you, you're my faith, you lift me off the ground." And she drew a picture of what she feels like. But she said, "Mom, I won't tell anyone what Dad's doing to me because I told them before and they didn't believe me." So our request to you, our resolution, is requesting that these, the man who created parental alienation syndrome committed suicide. He believed that incest was normal. And we're asking that these things not be allowed to be used in the nation's courts. They're being used all over the country. I got connected to this organization because on the Mothers of Lost Children website, they actually talk about what will happen to you, as they call us protective mothers. And it happened to me word for word what they had described. My story is not an isolated story. I didn't believe it at the time. And I've had politicians try to help me, heads of organizations, the Attorney General's office. No one can save you from a family court judge. So we have got to change the laws in order to protect these children.
I just want to let the staffers here know that one of the things we're really looking into is a federal oversight hearing. It's we've been going around to different members of Congress. May I just ask, please, whose offices and what state you represent?
Congressman Raskin from Maryland.
Hank Johnson, Georgia.
Congressman Castor from New Hampshire.
Thank you. And we had two others that already left. So, Judith, did you want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the basis of parental alienation syndrome. Gardner, his book defines it as being based on Alfred Kinsey. You know, you can't get away from that. Alfred Kinsey was a very famous pedophile who was raping children as part of his sexual behavior in the human male, sexual behavior in the human female. And that's on record, and anything we can do to try and get that clarified and part of your cases, we'll be happy to do. And anything that we can do to get the Trump's ruling, or what's it called again?
Immigration, it's new executive order. on
Yeah, the
immigration.
executive order on immigration to focus on getting Mila back is also something that we can all gather around this for. Yeah, happy to help you wherever I can.
I would just like to add for the staffers' benefit and knowledge that having worked in domestic violence for many years, the battered women's movement started in the 70s because domestic violence existed in secrecy. That's how it existed, and that's how it thrived. It's exactly the same right now with child sexual abuse and its same problems in family court. These stories are not isolated stories. As I said in the beginning, this is a growing public health epidemic that has major social costs. So I'm going to turn now to Dr. Rosen, just very briefly outline, or are there any specific questions maybe from the staff?
Yeah, I think that I have outlined possible federal solutions, and you'll find them in your packets. And because time is short, I think I'd rather leave that aside and have people ask questions, with the time that we have left.
Yeah, and I would like to urge the mothers who know other mothers in the states represented by the staffers to actually connect with the staffers or get their cards, and so that you can connect them with the mothers in their appropriate states. But do we have any questions for you young staffers that were so brave to stay with us today and taken the time? We so appreciate it because you are going to help move this problem. I want to just, are there any questions right now? Okay, we'll pass our cards around, and I want to recognize Catherine Campbell, who's here heading up California Protected Parents Association also. But please feel free to come and talk to the mothers. I just want to end with one thing, with just a little sense of hope, because you showed us that children are resilient and that there is a sense of hope. But one of the things that I want the staffers to remember, and for you to pass on to your many, many bosses and many layers here in Congress, is that, quote from Margaret Mead, "Never doubt that a small group of individuals can change the world. It is indeed the only thing that ever has." So we hope to stay in contact with you all. We hope that you will be our voices as well to help be the ripple effect for this problem. And we are more than happy to provide you the information that you need so that you will be ready once we're moving forward with our different federal asks. And with that, I want to thank everyone for being here today, but please feel free to talk to everybody that's here. Thanks so much. Thank you.
That afterwards.
I'll put it on YouTube for you.
Thank you.
I'll give my suggestion.
Details? Love it.
So you're over in, are you in?
Yeah. I'm up on the second floor. Hey, thanks for coming over.
Thank you for being here.
All right. Do you think that we're going to reach the tipping point?
I think we are. I think there's enough individuals now speaking out all across the nation, and it sounds like worldwide after this briefing about the same thing. And I think, as Maravik said, domestic violence started as a silent crisis and epidemic, and the silence is the killer. If it's silent, it's in darkness, and it can't ever be solved. It can't be looked at. If you're not aware of something, you can't fix a problem. So this awareness level that we're at right now is critical. It's the first step, and it's the only step that needs to be taken, really, in order to get to that level where people are talking about it and brainstorming, and then it becomes a thing we can do something about. Before, it wasn't even a thing. It didn't exist. So speaking out is the key.
Thank you.